The street lights flickered as the mother tightened the jacket around her son's tiny body. It was not even a proper jacket, just an oversized sweatshirt she had found discarded in a donation bin weeks ago. The fabric smelled faintly of mildew. No matter how many times she tried to wash it in public restrooms, but it was all she had to shield him from the creeping cold. With the boy pressed against her chest, his small arms wrapped loosely around her neck, she moved from house to house, on the edges of the neighborhood, knocking softly first, then harder when nobody came. Sometimes she waited minutes before trying again, hoping a light would flicker on, a window would open, a voice would answer. But the night remained silent, the windows dark. When someone did respond, it was through a locked door, a sharp voice, telling her to leave or worse. A look through the blinds, quickly pulled shut again, as if she were a threat, a shadow to be erased. Each rejection chipped away at something inside her. Still, she forced herself to the next door, and the next. She whispered promises into her son's ear, telling him they would find a warm bed tonight, that everything would be all right. Her words trembled under the weight of their own impossibility. His head rested heavily against her shoulder, too tired, too young to understand the full cruelty of being invisible in a world that only noticed you when it wanted you gone. In one house, she thought she saw movement behind the curtains, the silhouette of a woman, but when she called out for help, her voice raw and desperate, the figure turned away. The porch light clicked off. Darkness swallowed them whole again. Hours dragged by. The boy whimpered in his sleep, and the mother's arms ached from carrying him. But she did not dare put him down. The concrete was too cold, too filthy, and some small instinct screamed that keeping him close was the only thing that mattered. She walked in circles now, exhausted, disoriented, retracing her own steps without meaning to. The streets emptied, cars disappeared into driveways. The wind picked up, carrying the bitter scent of rain. She had nothing left to offer, no clever words, no dignity to bargain with. Only a silent, pleading hope that someone would see a mother and her child and remember that mercy was a choice. When the first drops of rain hit her skin, cold and sharp, she knew the night had made its decision. There would be no open door, no shelter offered, no stranger moved by the sight of them. The world had closed itself against her, and she, too tired to knock again, too broken to cry, turned away. She tightened the thin blanket around her son and began walking down the forgotten road where the old car waited. Its rusted frame leaned crookedly against the curb, vines creeping over its wheels, forgotten by everyone but her. In the daylight, people crossed the street to avoid it, pretending not to notice the shape of two figures inside. At night, it became their home. She yanked open the heavy door, its hinges screeching in protest, and slipped inside. The familiar damp smell, a mix of mold and old vinyl, enveloped them. She adjusted the cloths she had pinned over the windows, securing them against the rain and against the curious glances of the occasional passerby. In the dim light from the broken street lamp, she saw their little world laid out as she had left it. The back seat strewn with clothes, a few battered toys tucked into the corner, a cracked plastic cup filled with rainwater. It was not a home, but it was the only place left that would not turn them away. The mother lowered her son carefully onto the back seat, tucking the blanket tightly around him, murmuring soft words to chase away his shivers. She smoothed back his damp hair with trembling hands. He stirred, but did not wake. Sitting beside him, she leaned her head against the cold window, listening to the steady drum of the rain against the roof, and for the first time that night, allowed the weight of everything to crush her. She was a woman who had knocked on every door she could find, who had pleaded, begged, and cried, and still found herself here, alone in a dead car on a dead street. Her stomach twisted in hunger, but she ignored it. There were no more moves to make tonight, no miracles left to pray. Vera. Tomorrow she would find the strength to pretend again, to smile at strangers, and act like she was just another tired mother walking her son to school or to the park. But tonight, she would stay hidden. Tonight, she would wrap herself around her childlike armor and hope the world forgot about them just a little longer. The boy shifted in his sleep, murmuring nonsense words, and without thinking, she began to tell him a story. Her voice was barely a whisper, weaving tales of castles built out of stars, of mothers who could lift mountains, of boys who rode on the backs of giant birds to find lands where nobody was ever hungry, ever cold, ever alone. She made the words bright and full of impossible colors, fighting the grayness that pressed in around them. She told herself the stories were for him, but deep down, she knew they were also for her. Because if she could make even one impossible thing feel real, maybe tomorrow would not seem so far away. Outside, the rain fell harder. The city lights blurred into smears of color on the wet streets. And inside the abandoned car, a mother cradled her son and whispered promises into the darkness, promises she did not know how to keep, but still made anyway. Because sometimes the only way to survive was to believe in a world you could not see and a hope you could not hold. Morning arrived, not with the gentle warmth of sunlight, but with a gray, heavy gloom that settled over everything. The mother woke to the dampness seeping into her bones, to the thin ache of her back twisted awkwardly against the car door, and to the soft, even breathing of her son, still cocooned beneath the patched blanket. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply watch him, to memorize the way his eyelashes clung together, the way his small fingers curled instinctively toward the thin fabric covering him. It was in these fragile moments that she could almost forget where they were, could almost believe they were simply napping after a long day at the park, or waiting for a friend to return with keys they had accidentally locked inside. But the hard truth settled in quickly, as it always did. This was no accident, no temporary inconvenience. This rusting, broken car was their home now, not by choice, but by necessity, and every day spent inside it stretched the meaning of survival a little thinner. The mother moved carefully, adjusting the cloth coverings over the windows to let in just enough light to see without inviting curious eyes. Privacy was a luxury she could barely afford. In the small, cramped space, she tried to create a world her son could live inside without feeling the walls closing in. She organized the few belongings they had managed to save: a plastic bag filled with a handful of worn clothes, a faded stuffed animal missing one ear, a battered notebook, and a stub of a pencil. These became treasures, artifacts of a life she tried desperately to keep stitched together. She folded one of the shirts into a square, setting it carefully near the stuffed animal to create what she called the toy shelf. It was no more than a sloped seat cushion, but she treated it with the reverence of a real home. She smoothed out the blanket that served as the boy's bed, tucking it in along the edges of the seat, pretending it was a proper mattress. She hung drawings from the boy's notebook on the fabric covering the windows, pinning them in place with bits of tape scavenged from public spaces. In the dim light, the sketches of smiling suns and crooked houses made the space feel almost alive. Every detail was a battle against despair. She knew the boy noticed more than he let on. Children, she had learned, were never as blind as adults, wanted them to be. He knew they did not live like the other families he saw in the park, with their coolers full of sandwiches and bottles of juice, their colorful kites and shining shoes. But he did not ask questions that she could not answer. Instead, he accepted the stories she wove as truth. This car was a magic ship, she told him. It was taking them across invisible oceans, through cities made of clouds, toward a kingdom where mothers and sons never had to sleep outside again. Each night, before closing his eyes, he would ask her where they were on the journey, and she would invent new landmarks, new victories, a mountain they had climbed, a river they had crossed, an enemy storm they had defeated by singing loudly. Into the wind. Her words became armor. shielding him from the growing cold, from the gnawing hunger, from the loneliness that threatened to unravel them both. Outside, the world moved on without noticing. People walked their dogs past the car without glancing inside. Bicyclists sped by, their faces set against the cold. Neighbors pulled into driveways, unloading groceries, chatting on cell phones, waving to each other across the street. No one saw them. Or perhaps they did and simply chose to look away. Invisibility, the mother had learned, was not a side effect of poverty. It was the system's most effective weapon. She watched the boy stir awake, blinking up at the sagging roof of the car with sleepy confusion before turning his face toward her with a small smile. "Where are we now, Mommy?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. She smiled back, though the effort pulled painfully at her heart. "We're just outside the city of stars," she whispered. "One more night, and we'll see them lighting up the sky, just like diamonds." He nodded solemnly, as if this were the most important mission in the world, and pulled his stuffed animal close to his chest. She helped him sit up, straightening his clothes, brushing dust and bits of leaves from his hair. They shared a dry granola bar she had saved from the day before, eating it slowly, savoring every crumb. Then she bundled him up in every layer. They had, preparing for the long day ahead, because they could not stay inside the car once the world woke up. That was the unspoken rule she had learned early. Stay invisible, keep moving, do not invite attention. She packed their few belongings into a single cloth bag, slung it over her shoulder, and with her son's small hand gripped tightly in hers, stepped back out into the chill morning air. The car sat behind them, silent and still, a shell of a life that could no longer contain them during daylight. She looked back only once, making sure the cloths still covered the windows properly, making sure it still looked like nothing more than a forgotten wreck to anyone passing by. Then, together, they walked, through alleys and side streets to parks and public restrooms where she could clean his face and hands, to playgrounds where she could sit and watch him pretend for a little while that he belonged among the other laughing children. Always watching, always calculating, always hiding the truth behind a thin smile and 1,000 silent prayers. In the evenings, when the sun began to dip low and the streets emptied again, they would return to the car. She would tell him the story of their day as if it were an adventure full of secret missions and near misses, as if scavenging half a sandwich from a trash can was a heroic triumph, as if finding a clean fountain to drink from was a treasure worth celebrating. Inside, the backseat bedroom surrounded by the scraps of the world they had managed to gather, she built a life out of threadbare hope. She stitched together dreams out of broken things, and every night, as the city slept and the cold crept closer, she held her son close and promised him that the journey would not end here, that the city of stars was just over the next hill, waiting for them, shining and full of light. Even if she no longer believed it herself, she told the story anyway, because sometimes telling the story was the only way to keep walking, to keep breathing, to keep hoping. The days bled into each other, stitched together by the rhythm of survival. Every morning, before the sun crested over the gray rooftops, the mother would gently shake her son awake, bundling him quickly in his worn clothes, smoothing his hair with her fingers as if it could erase the fact that they had slept inside a dead car, hidden behind stained curtains. They slipped out onto the street like shadows, avoiding the stares of early commuters and the cautious glances of shop owners setting up their storefronts. She learned the art of invisibility not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. Invisibility was safety. Invisibility was the thin line between existing and being erased completely. She would guide her son toward the parks, the libraries, the few public spaces where lingering was not questioned. On good days, they spent hours in the warmth of the library, thumbing through children's books, tracing the pictures with small, eager fingers. She taught him to read in the corner of the children's section, using stories to anchor him in a reality that was slipping further and further out of reach. She whispered definitions and letters into his ear, as if planting seeds in soil, she prayed, would never dry up. She watched him absorb everything, his mind quick, bright, undimmed by the life they carried on their backs. When the library closed, or when the glances from librarians grew too pointed, they wandered to playgrounds. She sat on splintered benches, her hands shoved deep into her pockets, feeling the rawness of her palms where the cold had split the skin. She watched her son climb rusting jungle gyms and chase after imaginary friends. Sometimes other children would look at him curiously, invite him into their games for a little while. And for those brief moments, the ache in her chest would ease. She would see him laughing, running, belonging, and she would pretend not to notice the way the mothers on the sidelines would tighten their grips on their purses, would call their children back with forced, polite smiles once they noticed the worn-out shoes on his feet, the dirt smudged across his jacket. Afternoons were the hardest. With nowhere to go and nothing to offer, the hours stretched out into a painful, yawning space she did not know how to fill. She rationed what little food she could find, scavenging behind grocery stores where the waste bins overflowed with bruised fruit and torn packages. She learned which clerks would turn a blind eye and which would chase her off with sharp words and sharper threats. Her pride, once so fierce and unyielding, had been stripped away in thin, painful layers until she stood exposed, willing to beg, willing to take whatever was thrown her way, just to keep her son from feeling the hollow gnaw of hunger. The boy rarely complained. He accepted dry crackers, half-eaten apples, and bottles of water as feasts, thanking her with a wide, grateful smile that made her heart shatter into quieter, sharper pieces each time. He did not ask why they no longer sat at a table to eat, why they no longer had a kitchen, a stove, a home. He simply adjusted in the way children do, with a resilience that terrified her. She wanted to believe that he would not remember these days, that his mind would soften the edges of the hunger, the cold, the shame. But deep down, she knew better. These invisible days would etch themselves into the fabric of who he would become. Sometimes, as the sun dipped low and the city's shadows grew longer, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to ask for real help, to walk into one of the churches that left their doors unlocked, to knock on the window of a police car, to surrender her pride completely and admit she could not do this alone. But every time she came close, fear stopped her cold. Fear of being judged, of being separated from her son, of losing the only thing she had left that mattered. Invisibility was a prison, but it was also a shield. As long as no one knew, they could stay together. As long as no one looked too closely, they could survive. The nights returned with heavy certainty, and they crept back to the car with the same silent routine. She checked the windows, checked the locks, arranged the makeshift bedding as best she could. She rubbed his hands between hers to warm them, told him stories about the journey they were still making, about the city of stars that grew closer every day. She wrapped her body around his, taking the brunt of the cold into herself, letting it sink into her skin, into her bones, so he could sleep more easily. And in the silent hours, when the streets emptied completely and only the distant hum of traffic remained, she stared up at the sagging roof of the car and wondered how much longer she could hold them both afloat. She wondered if hope was just another thing she would eventually have to let go of, like the apartment they lost, like the job that slipped through her fingers, like the family members who stopped answering her calls. There were no news stories about them. No one was coming. There would be no rescue, no sudden hand reaching out of the dark. If they were to be saved, it would be by her own hands, trembling and raw though they were. She had long since stopped asking why this had happened. It no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was the next meal, the next safe corner, the next day. In the world beyond their car, people lived lives full of plans and destinations, of holidays and new clothes and clean sheets. In her world, every day was a negotiation with fate, a quiet battle against the slow erasure of everything human inside her. She did not expect fairness anymore. She only hoped for endurance. And so, the invisible days continued, one bleeding into the next, marked only by the small victories she guarded fiercely. A hot cup of coffee handed over by a kind stranger who asked no questions, a playground without bullies, a night without rain leaking through the car roof. These were her miracles, now humble and fleeting. And each night, as she kissed her son's forehead and whispered promises she was no longer sure she could keep, she clung to them with everything she had left. The first true cold arrived like an uninvited guest, slipping into every crack and seam of the old car, curling itself around the mother and her son with merciless fingers. It was not just the chill of the air or the frost on the windows that broke her, but the way the cold seemed to amplify everything else they had been trying so hard to survive. The little blanket, the layers of mismatched clothes, the tight curls of their bodies pressed together. None of it was enough anymore. The cold soaked through it all, indifferent and cruel. The boy started coughing at night. At first it was a dry, soft sound, easily masked by her stories and her songs. But soon it deepened, rattling through his small chest like a warning bell she could not unhear. She wrapped him tighter each night, using her own body to block the worst of it, whispering lies against his fevered skin about warm days ahead, about the sun returning soon. During the day, she sought patches of sunlight like a desperate animal, letting him sit against the concrete, walls of abandoned buildings just to feel some shred of warmth. She cupped his small, reddened hands in hers, breathing onto them, rubbing them back and forth until they stopped trembling for a few precious minutes. She scavenged even harder, searching not just for food now, but for anything that could act. As insulation, newspapers, old towels, scraps of plastic. She stuffed them into the cracks of the car, lined the floor with flattened cardboard boxes she found behind dumpsters. She found a discarded space heater in a trash pile once and dragged it all the way back to their shelter, only to realize it would never work without power. She sat with it in her lap that night anyway, pretending it was real, pretending it was enough because what else was there to do? Each night stretched longer than the last. She would lie awake, measuring the minutes between the boy's coughing fits, counting the number of times he shifted restlessly in his sleep, feeling the raw fear bloom bigger and bigger inside her. She pressed her lips to his forehead, feeling the unmistakable heat there, and fought the urge to panic. There was no hospital she could turn to, no emergency room that would not see right through her thin lies. No doctor, we're just between homes. No officer, I didn't put him in danger. No, sir, please don't take him away from me. One night, when the wind howled through the broken seals of the car doors and her son's coughs had reduced to a weak, painful rasp, she knew she had to try something, anything. She remembered reading somewhere that car engines stayed warm for a while after being run. Desperate, she forced herself out into the night, her bare hands shaking as she pried open the hood. She didn't know much about engines, but she knew enough to start it once or twice a day, just long enough to generate a little warmth, careful not to attract attention or drain whatever dying battery the car still had. That night she started it and left it running for a few precious minutes, then shut it down and rushed back inside, dragging the boy close to the cooling metal of the dashboard, hoping it would buy them a little more time. The next morning, she woke to find frost rimmed along the edges of the inside windows. Her fingers were stiff, slow to respond. Her lips cracked when she tried to smile at her son, to reassure him. She dug through the bag for anything edible, anything that might fuel their bodies against the cold. Half a bruised banana, a crumpled granola bar missing its wrapper. She split it evenly, giving him the bigger half. They could not afford to walk. The city that day, the boy's legs trembled too much. She wrapped him up as best she could, layered his tiny frame in every stitch of clothing they owned, and huddled with him in the back seat, their breath misting the air inside the car. She told him it was a day for rest, a day to save their strength for the journey ahead. In truth, she could not bear the thought of facing the world outside, the pitying looks, the curt dismissals, the way people's eyes slid over them like they were stains no one wanted to clean. That night she felt her own body beginning to betray her. The exhaustion, the hunger, the cold. It had been gnawing at her for so long that it no longer felt like something separate from herself. It was inside her now, thick and heavy, dragging at her limbs, fogging her mind. She found herself fading, her head lolling against the seat even as she tried to stay awake. Even as her son shifted weakly beside her, she fought it. She fought it because she had no other choice. She fought it because there was no one else in the world looking out for her boy but her. Every time her eyes slipped closed, she forced them open again, biting down on her own tongue, slapping her own face, anything to stay alert. Because what if the cold took her in her sleep? What if he woke up alone in this freezing tomb, she thought, of all the mothers she had seen in her life, who seemed so invincible, so capable, and wondered if they had ever felt this kind of terror, this crushing sense of failure. She wondered if they knew what it was like to love something so fiercely that the idea of leaving it behind broke you more than the hunger, more than the cold, more than the shame. Sometime before dawn, the boy woke coughing harder than before, his small body racked with shivers he could not control. His eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever, and he whispered, "Mommy, are we almost there?" She pulled him into her lap, cradling him against her chest, rocking him gently. "Almost," she whispered back, her voice cracking. "We're so close. Just a little longer?" She did not know if he believed her. She did not know if she believed herself. But she told the story anyway, because that was all she had left to give. Her hands moved over his back in slow circles, her lips pressed against his damp hair, and she whispered about the city of stars waiting just beyond the next sunrise. She whispered about warm beds and golden lights and doors that opened wide, without needing to knock, and somewhere in the deep frozen darkness, as the car groaned under the weight of the cold and the city outside continued to turn its blind eye, she promised him again that they would make it. Even if she had to crawl, even if she had to break herself apart piece by piece, they would make it because she was a mother, and mothers did not stop, not even when the cold came. The morning broke heavy and colorless, the sky sagging low, pulling the last threads of warmth from the air. The mother woke, stiff and sore, her arms still wrapped tightly around her son's fragile body. For a long moment, she did not move. She stayed frozen, listening to the shallow sound of his breathing, feeling the faint beat of his heart against her chest. It was slower now, weaker. A silent alarm rang through every part of her, louder than the wind rattling the car, louder than the hunger gnawing at her insides. She knew without looking that something had shifted in him overnight, something vital slipping further away. She had run out of stories to tell. She had run out of lies to soften the edges of their reality. All that remained was the truth, raw and cold and impossible to fix. Her boy was getting sicker, and she had nothing left to fight with. Panic simmered just under her skin, threatening to break through, but she forced it down. She needed to think clearly, needed to move. Gently, she shifted his weight, tucking the blanket tighter around him, whispering promises she could not guarantee she would keep. "Stay here, my love," she breathed against his forehead. "Stay safe. I'll be right back." Her legs almost buckled when she stepped out of the car. Every joint screamed in protest, but she pushed forward. The street was empty, the early hours shielding her from curious eyes. She stumbled down the cracked sidewalk, clutching the fabric of her jacket closed. Against the wind, searching for someone, anyone who might help. She scanned the faces of the few people hurrying past. A man with headphones, a woman dragging a dog on a leash, A teenager hunched over a phone. None of them looked at her. She was still invisible. Her mind raced with impossible choices. Should she call an ambulance? Risk authorities finding out they had been living in a car? Would they tear her son away from her, place him in some sterile foster home where he would be just another case number, another sad story? Would he hate her for that? Would he understand that everything she had done, every moment of humiliation and hunger and desperation, had been to keep them together? Tears blurred her vision as she pressed forward. She stumbled near the curb and caught herself on a street pole, breathing hard, fighting against the blackness creeping at the edges of her sight. She needed help. She needed to swallow her fear and ask. But who would listen? Who would care? She crossed into the small parking lot behind a strip of closed stores, her eyes scanning desperately for a payphone, for a security guard, for a miracle. And then she saw him. The man was pushing a large garbage bin toward the service entrance of a store, dressed in the green overalls of a cleaning crew. He moved slowly, deliberately, humming something tuneless under his breath. He looked up as she approached, and for the first time in days, someone truly saw her. His eyes didn't skip past her. They didn't harden in suspicion or narrow in disgust. He saw the way she trembled, the way her clothes clung to her thin frame, the wild, broken fear in her eyes. Without thinking, she moved toward him. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Only a soft, desperate sob escaped her throat. He dropped the handle of the bin and took a step closer. His face was lined, weathered, familiar in a way that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with understanding. He raised a hand, palm open, slow and careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice low, steady. She shook her head, the tears spilling faster now, her body racked with silent cries she could not control. She tried to explain, tried to string together the words, son, sick, cold, car, but they tangled in her mouth, stuck behind the wall of shame and exhaustion. The man didn't press her. He looked past her brokenness, past the dirt on her skin and the tremble in her hands. He nodded once, firmly, as if making a decision, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a worn cell phone and handed it to her. "Call whoever you need," he said simply, "or tell me where. I'll come." The offer, so small and so monumental, broke something loose inside her. She took the phone with shaking fingers, clutching it like a lifeline, and pressed it to her chest. For a moment before forcing herself to focus, the man stayed close, not crowding her, not questioning, just waiting, a steady presence in the cold. She told him about the boy, about the car parked just down the street. She stumbled through the words, barely coherent, but he understood. He moved quickly, guiding her back toward the car, his steps, firm and certain, where hers faltered. When they reached the battered vehicle, he peered inside through the cracked windshield, taking in the makeshift nest of blankets and cardboard, the small, fevered boy curled on the back seat. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He pulled out a walkie-talkie from his belt and spoke into it quietly, calling for someone named Frank, asking him to bring supplies, blankets, water, a first aid kit. His voice was calm, competent, the voice of someone who had seen worse and refused to be afraid of it. Within minutes, another man arrived, carrying a duffel bag filled with essentials. They worked together without fanfare, bundling the boy carefully, checking his breathing, offering the mother a thermos of warm tea she gripped with both hands like a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood. No one asked for explanations. No one demanded to know why she had ended up here. They simply helped. It wasn't a rescue, not in the way the movies like to show. There was no flashing siren, no dramatic music, no promises of happily ever after. It was quieter than that, more fragile, a simple human gesture, offered without judgment, without conditions. The man who found her gave her a look as he handed her a second blanket, a look that said, He knew she wasn't broken beyond repair, that somewhere underneath the dirt and the fear and the hunger, there was still a woman fighting like hell to save her child. They didn't promise her miracles. They didn't lie and say everything would be easy from now on, but they opened a door, a real one, a door she didn't have to knock on, didn't have to beg for, and that was enough. As she cradled her son against her chest, feeling the blessed weight of his slow, steady breathing, she closed her eyes and, for the first time in what felt like forever, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the city of stars wasn't so far away after all. Maybe it had been hidden all along, not in golden gates or shining towers, but in the small, stubborn kindness of ordinary people who chose to see what others refused to look at. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep moving forward.